Breaking the gray.
Why is everyone wearing helmets? What's happening here?
This is the... We're wearing our red light helmets because this is the Red Light for the Brain episode.
Oh, it's amazing. These are the Neuronic Neuradiant 1070s, correct?
Yes, this is the Neuronic.
They look amazing. They look amazing. Now, we're looking, and this is also an audio podcast, plus we're doing the video portion of it. We wouldn't just have a helmet here. We actually have a special guest that's underneath the helmets. Right, Sarah?
Yes, we have Dr. Marvin Bernard, who is the clinical director, co-founder of Neuronic, who is going to talk to us about this kind of cutting-edge tech, which is the latest in near-infrared light helmets for brain health. We have spoken to Marvin before, but I think a lot's happened, actually, Marvin, since we last spoke.
Well, if you count COVID, a granddaughter, and giving birth to the new version of the photobiomodulation system and establishing a company called Neuronic, yes, I would say things have been kind of busy.
Yeah, you've been pretty busy and pretty at it. So we're very interested to first of all talk about the company and the helmet and how it works, and also to kind of remind people a bit of background as to, why this is such important technology and your role in that and your findings, because I know, it's something that's obviously I have a lot of heart for this and it's something that I totally believe in, but let's hear from you a little bit about the development since we last spoke, and specifically, who is this aimed at and who can benefit and how does it work?
Sure. Well, I think where we might have left off was that the team at Quiet Mind Foundation, which is the group that I set up these 22 years ago, we've been working on advancing the idea of integrating photobiomodulation with brainwave biofeedback training. And the first iteration of that had to do with using just neurofeedback and showing how by decreasing the slow wave amplitude and increasing the faster frequency amplitudes, we could in fact mitigate some of the cognitive and behavioral problems that people were having as they developed early to mid-stage dementia.
Sorry, Marvin, just to butt in, just a little bit to butt in there. Maybe you could just explain exactly what you mean by that, because I'm sure not everybody will know about brainwaves.
So the electrical activity that you can measure coming from the brain is called EEG, or it's using a electroencephalography as the type of technology where you're basically taking the same kind of sensors that you would have with an EKG, and you're putting them on your head. And you're then measuring the electricity, the voltage that's coming from your brain instead of from your heart. That's essentially the difference. But when you can then place electrodes, sensors, at, say, 19 different locations on your head, and everybody in the world who's doing research on EEG is using the same exact 19 locations, now you can start to develop a database of recordings and evidence about what's going on that covers the broadest range of people. So now you get a population of data that has those two tails, or what we would call the bell curve. And so when you start doing that, you can start doing statistics that tell you how somebody compares, how some individual's brain activity compares with the average for a group of people that are already in the database that have been scanned, and you can see how do you stack up against the average of people who are, say, within 2 years of your age, who were male or female, who were right-handed, left-handed. You can now see how are you like or how are you not like those people who were carefully screened and put into the database. By having that kind of information, we can now set up a training program, right, based on how that person's individual brain activity was either above or below the mean, right, the average. So we can then say, oh, your dementia or your memory problems seem to have something to do with not producing as much electrical activity in this particular range of frequencies. Why don't we set up a training program to help you develop more ability to produce those particular brainwaves? Is that making sense?
It does, but I wonder if we could just go back just a little bit, because I think for a lot of people listening, they might not even know that our brains are emitting waves of certain frequency. You know, and Marvin, you did a double take then, but I think for some people that's news. You know, the brain actually does have oscillations that you can measure outside of the skull, and actually they correlate to different things. And so, you know, certain oscillations correspond to when you're focused. Certain oscillations correspond to when you're asleep. And that's measurable outside of the head.
And is that why they say that person's got a really good vibe?
Marvin?
Only somebody with a kind of hippie history would maybe say that.
Okay.
I would say that.
So if you're from the 60s, you might say that.
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible you can tell somebody's frequency by being in the same room. But what we're talking about here is very specific brain patterns that you can measure outside of the brain that's going on. And also these correspond to pathology. So, you know, if there's something going wrong with your brain, that can be detected using these oscillations from the outside.
And that's absolutely true. And one of the things that I have been working on all my career is really how do specific patterns exist in the person's experience at different levels, and how can you understand the challenges that they may be having by understanding the ways in which those patterns of activity are different based on different kinds of experiences that people have. So way back when, in the exploration of, say, Freudian psychology in the 1920s, I don't know that we went over this the first time around, but the idea that people who have had psychological or emotional trauma then develop specific patterns of chronic muscular tension in their body that is directly associated with the response to the traumatic experience. So when people develop these chronic patterns of tension, it has to do with their responding to the emotional overwhelm of whatever the experience was and learning ways to cope with those kind of overwhelming experiences. Well, that, when you're a child, what you're going to learn to do is tense up certain muscle groups in order to cope with the overwhelming emotional experience. By tensing up your muscles, you're also doing something in your brain. So there's always going to be a correlation between psychological or psychic trauma and specific patterns of muscular tension, which would also then have a direct corollary to specific changes in brain function, brain activity. So one of the ways we can measure that brain activity is with the EEG. And what I've suggested is that we can look at the EEG in certain ways that I don't think we need to get into in this conversation, but talking just about dominant frequency and looking at the range and variability of those frequencies, we can then build a set of hypotheses or an idea about what may have happened to someone that would then cause a restriction in the range and variability of the EEG, in the same way that we see that corresponding pattern of constriction in the musculature in the body.
Yeah.
It's fascinating because it's really not, I mean, it's not the first time, but we start talking about quantified self. It's really fascinating to be able to quantify with data and measurement traumatic episodes that are happening in the brain. And then now we're applying to it real time of like, it's not just meditation and saying, I'm having an episode, I'm going to sit outside of it and acknowledge it. No, we can actually do something about it now. It's really fascinating.
So we can then begin to identify that someone on the autistic spectrum is going to show differences in the correlation between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere that's different than people who are not, quote, who are neurotypical. And we can start to see that there are differences, just like we can now see that there are differences between someone who has early, like mild cognitive impairment and somebody who's got early to moderate Alzheimer's disease. Just like we can see patterns of activity in the occipital area in terms of coherence or the correlation between left and right. In somebody with Parkinson's disease, we can see that there's a disconnection, a characteristic pattern of disconnection across all of the frequency bands in the occipital left and right hemispheres. Those are the kind of things that we're beginning to now see that we can then set up an intervention like neurofeedback where we can help people retrain and renormalize the EEG activity. But now, because we know that we can change brain electrical activity simply by pulsing light on the scalp, because we know that we can do that, we can now kind of get two birds for one, or you know what I mean, a twofer. So we can get two results for the same intervention because we can pulse light on the scalp and train a different reaction in the EEG while we're also directing energy directly into the brain tissue itself that is going to have a healing and helpful, facilitative and neuroprotective result, as a result. So that is both on a tissue level, reparative and healing and protective, and at the neurophysiological or electrophysiological level, we're also helping to renormalize the connectivity that got disrupted by the trauma.
Yeah. So really what you're saying, I mean, this is like next level red light therapy because it's tailored, which is something that, is not, this is something totally new and something totally exciting is that you can measure someone's brain, look for where there are these imbalances, and then target that directly using, like we've just shown the helmet. It's very, very simple tech, but sophisticated in that you can target different areas of the brain at different times with different frequencies.
I definitely think that with the helmet and with the technology that we've developed now with the new controller, the new version of the Neuradiant now has the ability to separate out quadrants. I'm not sure what would be the easiest way to show that in the segment. If I held up the device, I could do it that way.
You can do it that way, but you will have to talk through it because some people are just on audio only. Talk us through it, Marvin.
Yeah, we can help.
Well, so what we've got is a controller that's touchscreen that we can now set up so that we can select which quadrant of the brain, frontal, occipital, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, we can select independently each one of those areas and then differentially stimulate each of those areas based on that quantitative EEG measurement that's telling us where somebody fits in and where somebody doesn't fit in. So if they're producing too much activity on the left and too little activity on the right and too much activity in the back and too little in the front, we can now set up a stimulation/training program that they can then go through on a regular basis, maybe daily, maybe every other day, depends on what we find when we're talking to them and developing the protocol. But we can then set up a regular training protocol that will provide the stimulation and thereby modify both the electrical activity and help with the tissue level healing for that particular part of the brain.
Maybe the best way to describe it would be to go through a case with us, Marvin. Have you got a case in mind of someone who you've gone through this process with?
Sure. There was someone with early stage Parkinson's where we found that they were having a tremor that was at about 5.7 cycles per second, right? We had them use their iPhone accelerometer to measure the extent of their hand tremor. And then we programmed the stimulation to be at one point a little bit faster and at another point a little bit slower than the 5.7 hertz of the frequency. And they put on the helmet and stimulated the back of the head, which is where the problem in Parkinson's is really happening, is in the substantia nigra back here. And so when they would put on the helmet and then stimulate at that slightly above and slightly below, what would happen is the brain would stop being in that stuck position and start to respond differently. And over a matter of minutes, you would see the tremor stop. And the more they could do that stimulation, the more they were breaking up the habitual, stuck, rigid pattern of response in the EEG. And that allowed their brain to reorganize, if you will, and establish a more differentiated pattern of responding. And so the tremor, which was the reaction, the stuck reaction, you know what happens when you tighten up a muscle? You get that thing called tetany. Well, neurologically, I think that's what tetany looks like in the brain, is that tremor. It's like the lack of range of and flexibility within the range of how the brain can organize responses. So that goes back to the bell curve and opening up and widening the range of possible responses that the brain can have to any given stimuli coming in. Instead of it being restricted for whatever reason to some particular stuck range of possibilities, we're then increasing the range of possibilities about how the brain can respond to any given stimulus. That's the long and the short of it.
Just how often and for what duration are you applying the stimulation to the brain to have an impact like that?
Well, yeah, that's a good one, because some people are still caught up in kind of the American capitalism mindset of healthcare, which is that more is always better. And that is completely not the case when we're talking about natural healing or organic healing processes. That's not the way it works. So sometimes less is even better than more. And there really is, I think the best way to think about this is to go back to Goldilocks, right? That sometimes things are too hot, sometimes things are too cold, and really sometimes things are just right. And what we really want to be looking for is, what is the just right intervention to expand that range of possible responses, expand the range and variability so that people have the greatest opportunity to respond in the most efficient way possible. Because really this is about efficiency. All right, so effective response in this case is really about the most efficient response, being able to do the task, burning the least number of calories up here.
And I think people are going to ask about, can light get into the brain? Because most people think it's very dark inside the skull, and you've got this barrier of brain. I mean, and I know that the special, you've got 1070 as a wavelength. And I think there's something very specific about that wavelength, because not all red light is the same.
No, well, all light goes on the full spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum. So what we consider to be visible is somewhere between 400 and 800 nanometers. And so what we're talking about now is something that's just above the visible range of red frequencies. And one thing to remember is, I think I said this the last time, that 85% of the reason why there's life on Earth is because of that the near infrared band of wavelength. So it's a very important area of stimulation and energy, but it's not an area in which heat is being generated. So the light gets through because it can penetrate to a certain degree, it can penetrate solid objects because of the wavelength, but it can penetrate only so far based on the amount of power that you're using. But the point is it can get through into the brain. And that's really what we're talking about. And then when you add the idea that we're talking about a curved, convex structure, and you've got light coming in from all around, right? When we're looking at the helmet, right, we're looking at light being generated from all different angles at once. So lots and lots of those light photons are hitting at different angles and landing on top of each other. And there's a principle in physics called constructive interference, where because the light photons are landing on top of each other, they're actually driving the light deeper and deeper. So when you do continuous stimulation, you don't get as deep a penetration as you would with the same amount of power per se and pulsing the light. So that's why we have built into the Neuradian both the continuous and the pulse, and being able to select the pulse rate from 1 to pretty much anything you would want. So that's going to make it very, very useful for a number of different purposes. But this idea of wavelength having unique biological properties is now a very, very hot topic in the photobiomodulation and photomedicine field. And we're very excited about all the different work that's been going on. Particularly, Sarah, you and I both know that the people at Durham University in the UK are going to be publishing information very soon showing how the 1070 nanometer light has very specific healing beneficial properties as it relates to COVID-19. And that and that 1070 has positive influences on infectivity, on virulence, and also on the post-infection sequelae, the result of neurological damage from what they call long COVID. So that 1070 can now be something that people can start thinking about and developing ways of applying it that can be very beneficial to people before they get infected, if they've been infected, and after they've been infected.
Yeah, it's very interesting, that wavelength.
Ask a quick question?
Well, I was just going to say, because I'm here in Austin right now. I'm kind of on my world tour of, well, sort of hopping around the world, starting kind of doing my little America bit now. But at Austin University, I had the pleasure. Thank you, Marvin. I had the pleasure of going to the lab there, and actually they're looking at that longer wavelength, not for all kinds of things, but most specifically for psychiatric. So mood disorders, depression, anxiety, bipolar.
Yep.
You know, that's really what their focus is. And they are also focusing on this longer red wavelength because of its ability to penetrate the skull more, but also it does seem to have a greater therapeutic action. So it's very interesting. There's so many pieces you need to get right. It's not just the pulsing. It's not just the area. It's the wavelength.
Well, Texas is definitely a center for this type of research because Hanli Liu at the University of Texas at Arlington, who worked with Professor Gonzalez-Lima for many years, now has a lab at UT Arlington, and she and her graduate students just published on the use of 810 laser and 810 LED light on the forearm, and 1264 nanometer laser on the forearm. And what they showed was that the higher wavelength stimulation significantly increased the level of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin in the blood, which is a good thing. But even more so, it increased the cytochrome C oxidase, which is the chemical, it's the protein that then gets stimulated by the light and helps to increase the production of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is the chemical catalyst for everything in the body. So we're seeing that this higher wavelength light does, in fact, have a better impact on a biological tissue level. in terms of things that are very important, both for blood flow, healing, neuroprotection, and overall health. So I'm very excited about what's going on in Texas. And Quiet Mind is working now with Professor Liu on developing a study that will use the Neuradiant device transcranially to do the same kind of replication that they did with the forearm, but now to show the difference between 810 transcranial and 1070 transcranial. So that's what's coming up next.
That was actually going to be my question. Is we talk a lot where you're a brain expert and red light expert, but I'm thinking you mentioned COVID, and I wonder about the heart. I wonder the impact of red light on organs and the heart. Is that something that's actually been studied?
Ischemic stroke has been studied in a mouse model and also in people in early, when somebody has a heart attack. And red light is now, and infrared light is now recommended as a frontline treatment for people who are in acute myocardial, infarction or stroke. So yes, it is something that's being studied, and I think it certainly deserves a lot more study, but certainly we're seeing that the gut, heart, brain connection is going to be facilitated by improving blood flow and decreasing inflammation. So any simple, non-invasive, non-drug, low side effect profile intervention like infrared light that can have that direct effect on increasing blood flow and decreasing inflammation is going to be a good thing across the board. That's why we've been doing it in conjunction with neurofeedback as a way to empirically measure. Hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to empirically measure in real time using the QEEG and heart rate variability. We'll be able to measure the impact of the light stimulation on brain function and cardiovascular function in real time.
I think it's important to realize, Russ, that to translate some of what Marvin was saying about the energy molecule, if you're supplying the body with energy, the body's going to use it where it needs it. If you're giving the body more energy generally. So it kind of sounds a bit like red light's a panacea, but really it's not directed at each specific condition. Yeah. But if you think of it as the way to give the body more energy, and then the body can heal however it sees fit. So
battery pack.
It's about, it's in a very simplistic term, more energy, greater blood flow, removal of toxins.
You've got to simplify. Yeah.
We have to keep getting away from. We have to keep getting away from the snake oil idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very hard sometimes.
It's difficult because, people are very focused on specific conditions, but to try and understand if you can address the root cause of all conditions, which basically the root cause of every chronic illness is a lack of energy and a buildup of toxins and inflammation. Once you address those things, you can really tackle any chronic illness. We just happen to be focused on the brain with the helmet. But red light therapy, has been used historically, wound healing, there's a range of, the list goes on, because it's tackling the root cause in a way that is sympathetic to the body, because as Marvin says, it's based on sunlight, the therapeutic property. We're mammals that have evolved under the sun. So, we're designed to respond to near infrared light.
And we've been seduced by Mr. Edison's product into a relationship with light that has taken us away from something that we were designed to respond to, which is when the sun comes up, we're doing something, and when the sun goes down, we're not. And that for a lot of 100,000 years, that's the way we rolled. And now for, 100 and something years, we've been doing something else. And systemically, it's not been such a great idea in many ways.
We have many sleep experts that Sarah and I have talked to that will agree with you there.
So given the fact that what we're trying to do is renormalize that circadian rhythm, we're talking about renormalizing a very basic process that underneath all of that is what that guy Newton was talking about with law number 2 about neither created nor destroyed. conservation of energy. So we got to go back to those guys and pay our respect, because it's really about efficiency. It's really about conserving energy, and it's really about managing the entire system. But you can't sell a pharmacopoeia of drugs for specific disorders if you think systemically. But now, because of what we've been doing, we have a range of disorders that are inherently systemic and not specific. So we need to be looking at ways to develop systemic interventions, because we've already got the other ones. We've already got the other ones covered in large measure. Now we've got to really work on the systemic one.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really telling, and I know Marvin's going to wince when I say this, wait for it, Marvin, is that people report better hair growth and things when you wear these devices. Look at Marvin's face. Which is, the thing is though, it's because when you're doing these treatments, you are improving general wellness. You are treating your brain for sure, but the upshot is ultimately you are allowing your body to heal, you're improving wellness generally, you're rising everything in your system. So you may have a treatment because you're looking at Parkinson's and all of a sudden find the pain in your knees go, because you're raising the level of health, you're raising what they call redox potential, like your body's ability to maintain and hold a charge. So we have all kinds of, people doing these brain treatments. You can't separate it out from the body. The body is a system. You raise one system, you raise everything. So we have pictures of people with these fabulous glowing locks after doing the brain treatments, which of course I know is kind of not what we're aiming for,
look,
but it's a happy side effect.
My skin looks much better. My hair hasn't fallen out as much. But I'm not allowed to talk about cosmetics when I'm also talking about dementia, or else the snake oil meter goes off the chart.
Yes, I know. You're very, very professional, Marvin, but I just wanted to point out from that point of view, it actually makes you feel better.
And that's really what it's about. Part of it's about feeling better.
This is always a topic, and the more we talk about red light, the more I feel like we should just dedicate the entire podcast, every episode to it. But I wonder about circadian rhythms, and is there a difference with DNA? And I ask that because we didn't all didn't all migrate to California. We weren't all born and raised in California. We all came from different parts of the world, and different parts of the world have different circadian light cycles, right? You've got, there's less light. Like my daughter goes to school in Seattle. I go up there, I'm like, why is it so dark and cold here? But I'm just further north. I just wonder, does DNA have an impact? Do you respond better if your origin is from the north, right? I don't know. I'm just curious. I'm very simplistic here, but curious.
Certainly, the people who talk about diet and nutrition, and certainly the Michio Kushis of the world, will tell you that you shouldn't be eating food that's grown more than 50 miles from the place where you were born.
Yeah, we did a podcast on that. Yeah, we did a podcast on that. Yeah. But
I get it. I understand what they're trying to say. I get it.
From an ancestral point of view, we are all from Africa, ultimately, so the science tells us. True. And certainly for a long, long period of human history, that's where humans evolved. And then we kind of populated different parts of the world, and we had adaptations to the sun, different pigmentation of the skin, other kind of adaptations. So certainly with light therapy, if you have dark pigmented skin, then you may need a slightly different time of light, because the pigment in the skin will absorb light to different degrees. But from a circadian point of view, I think humans really are kind of still in that Africa ancestry. Our DNA is designed to have sunrise and sunset. People who are living in the north of Finland, they do struggle, even though they've lived there for a long time,
still hard.
It's still very difficult for humans to live in that condition, even if you have got the white skin and the blue eyes and all the adaptations.
Why don't igloos have windows?
It's a joke, Marv. Is it going to be a dirty joke?
Fine glass.
So no. I'm sorry. Yeah, that sounds like the beginning of a Henny Youngman joke. It does. It's something. No. But I can work on a good punchline. But the point is, igloos don't have windows because they really want to go from light to dark, and they need that light and then they really need dark in order to have that differentiation. And that's what keeps them healthy, that differentiation from one pole to the other pole. And it's like that process of cell division, if we think about it phylogenetically or, developmentally, the process of differentiation always starts with a binary division. So it's that binary division that we're really dealing with, of going from one to the other, and that oscillation from one pole to the other. So from left hemisphere to right hemisphere, from inhaling to exhaling. It's all, the heartbeat, the diastolic and systolic. I mean, it's all the same kind of process of measuring and improving the variability and the range and the flexibility of that binary process, right? The sequoias can stay right where they are for 3,000 years because of the environment and because of the structure that they've created. The bamboo has to be different because of what's coming at the bamboo and what's happening in that environment. It has to be more flexible. So that's why we're working with heart rate variability and the QE and the EEG in the way that we're approaching this, because counterintuitively, the healthiest heart is the one with the greatest amount of interbeat variation. I don't know whether you've covered that already.
No, we haven't gone into heart rate variability. But to your point,
it's very important.
It's very important. And to your point, Russ, do people adapt to these conditions? The body does make these adaptations, like even in the mitochondria, but this is so new science. They're even finding different haplotypes within the mitochondria that maybe allowed humans to live at different latitudes, like uncoupling of oscillators that are associated with circadian signaling. But really, this whole study is so new. We don't actually know exactly how all these systems work. Yes, there are adaptations, but it does seem that most humans still respond to that day-night cycle. And if you don't get that, regardless of,
Right.
You've lived in California your whole life and you're used to the sun rising and setting at certain times,
Doesn't matter.
You need to have those cues. Yeah.
And Sarah, and Russ, just by way of an example, how long ago was the first time you heard the word epigenetic used?
Yeah, maybe 10 years ago.
For me, when I met Sarah.
So now, very recently, we're seeing papers being published showing that the significance of epigenetics may even be greater than the root DNA that we're carrying around all the time, and that the influence of epigenetic phenomena can be even greater in terms of influencing changes in DNA and subsequent changes in, our genetic makeup from generation to generation.
Yeah, so that's changes that are not associated directly with the DNA. They're not mutations. These are epigenetics, means above genetics. So it's adaptations due mainly to our environment. Yeah, it's
both internal and external.
Internal and external environment. Yes, but it's a very interesting field of study, and I think it's going to explode all the mitochondrial medicine soon. So it's cool to kind of be on the forefront of that.
Good. Are we still talking about what we're supposed to be talking about today?
Well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll get back on track. Let's get back on track, Marvin.
We'll get back on track.
And maybe tell us about the device and where people can get it.
Yeah, let's please do that, because we're at the tail end here and we want people to get this device, and we have links up. And
I certainly want people who think this could be useful to contact us at neuronic.online. So that's neuronic.online. And Neuronic is the company that's been set up to take the work that we've been doing at Quiet Mind and bring it into the commercial sphere, because we're going to stay with consultation and research and keep our nonprofit status somewhat pristine.
And who should be looking at getting it, Marvin?
Sense.
Well, people who are interested in using light to enhance their cognitive and other levels of functioning, for sure, can use the more basic level program that doesn't include all the 4 quadrants and the protocol development stuff. But for people who have a diagnosis or who are concerned because of family history of dementia or other kinds of neurodegenerative conditions, people who've got a history of head trauma, people with Parkinson's, anything like that, I think they would probably want to move toward getting the 4 quadrant capability. So there's the 1070 standard device, and then there's the 1074Q for 4-quadrant, and you can choose one or the other at the website. And the 4Q program comes with 3 months of consultation with myself and Sarah or some other consultants who are within the Neuronic organization, who will be providing clinical and technical consultation to people at no extra charge. So the purchase price of the 4Q device brings with it 3 months of consultation to make sure that people are getting really the best value and the best results that they can from the technology.
That's amazing. And just so everyone knows, we have a website, rebelscientist.com, where you can actually go to the Rebel Scientist store. There's a big button that says RS store, and RS stands for Rebel Scientist for people with my size brain. It's not, and size does not matter when it comes to the brain. I know this. I've learned this too. Even the smallest of brains can be powerful. And the links are all there. We have everything up. We're incredibly excited to get this device in people's hands. I definitely just want to wear it constantly because I want to see my hair.
Careful.
No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. I have my grandfather passed away a few decades ago from Parkinson's, and watched it happen. And DNA wise, biologically, I'm very much like my grandfather, and I worry so much about that. He had a lot of strokes when he was in his 50s and 60s and led to, the Parkinson's. But ultimately, what you're doing is amazing work, and sharing it is what we're here to do. So.
And it's proactive, Russ. You don't have to let yourself get to that level. It's proactive. If you want to preempt it and not get these, because prevention is so much easier than cure. This is what I'm, trying to get people to buy these devices or use them when they feel like they haven't got any symptoms is an ask. But, how much would you give not to get that illness? So I think, if you have someone, who's got neurodegeneration, these things are brilliant. If you haven't, still use these devices, because 10 minutes a day
Absolutely.
sitting, why wouldn't you do that if you could prevent these?
Proactive.
Be proactive.
Yes. That might be our season 3 tagline. Proactivity is the key.
Proactive advice for rebel scientists.
Don't wait.
Yeah.
Don't wait till it's too late. Proactivity is the key. All right.
Well, I'm very grateful to you guys for doing this work. It's extremely important. People like us really need to get with people like you to get the word out there, because, that's not what we do for a living. We're trying to answer the question at a pretty granular level, and then it really needs to be translated out to, so what the heck is this good for, and what am I supposed to do with it, and how do I do it?
Yeah, people need to know the tools that are available. So thank you so much for coming on again, Marvin. It's always a pleasure. And I'm sure it won't be the last time.
I hope not. I can't wait. I can't wait till we have the integrated version.
That's it. Okay. Until then. All right.
Stand by.
Stand by. All right.
Bye.
Chat soon, Marvin. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. The Rebel Scientist podcast is a Breaking the Gray production, hosted by Sarah Turner and Russ Eisenman. Audio production by Dave Visaya and the podcast engineers. For more information and for our biohacking shopping guide, visit rebelscientist.com. To hear more incredible Breaking the Gray production podcasts, visit breakingthegray.com. That's gray with an E. breakingthegray.com.
Break